When we think of Rome, we think of conquest, of generals, senators, and men who seem to command history itself.
We think of public power, speeches delivered in the forum, armies raised in the name of glory, rivalries that ended in blood.
But some of Rome's most important bonds were never forged on the battlefield.
They were arranged in households, negotiated between families, and sealed, not with victory but with marriage.
Among Rome's noble houses, marriage was rarely a private matter. It was a political instrument,
One that could secure alliances, protect status, connect bloodlines, and quietly reshape the balance of power.
A wedding could bring stability to one family and ambition to another.
It could soften old hostilities, strengthen fragile loyalties, or conceal tensions that would later tear the Republic apart.
To understand how Rome truly held itself together,
We have to look beyond war and rhetoric, to the marriages that quietly bound its ruling houses together.
because in Rome, marriage was never simply about two individuals.
It was about lineage, alliance, and the preservation of power.
One of the easiest mistakes a modern viewer can make when looking at ancient Rome
Is to imagine that marriage belonged to the private world, while politics belonged to the public one. That division feels natural to us. We think of the home as intimate and personal, and the state as public and institutional. Rome did not think in those terms. In Roman elite life, the family was never sealed off from politics. It was one of the main engines through which politics functioned. To the Roman aristocracy, a household was not simply a domestic space. It was a structure of authority, inheritance, obligation, and reputation. A marriage, therefore, was not merely the union of two individuals who wished to build a life together. It was the joining of lineages, property, expectations, and networks of loyalty. If a Roman nobleman married well, he did not simply gain a wife. He gained a connection to another house, another ancestry, another set of patrons, allies, obligations, and ambitions. If a Roman noblewoman married into another great house, she did not merely leave one home for another. She became the living bridge through which two families could exchange trust, status, and strategic advantage. Roman legal and social structures treated the family as a core social unit, and scholars of Roman marriage have long noted that elite marriages often carried immediate political significance, especially among houses of comparable rank. That is why the Roman world cannot be understood through speeches, offices, and battles alone. The Forum showed power in performance. Marriage revealed power in construction. What looked like a wedding feast could in fact be a negotiation over future office, legitimacy, or influence. What looked like a private union could silently stabilize a faction, soften a rivalry, or place two ambitious houses into a relationship from which neither could easily withdraw. In Rome, public history was often built on private arrangements. The visible world of magistracies and military commands rested on a less visible architecture of kinship and alliance. Elite marriage was one of the clearest expressions of that architecture. This is why saying marriage in Rome can be misleading if it sounds too universal or too sentimental. Roman marriage meant different things across class, place, and period. But among the upper ranks of Roman society, especially in the Republic and early Empire, marriage was deeply entangled with political life. The Roman name itself advertised family identity as much as individual identity, and noble status depended not only on wealth, but on ancestry, memory, and the ability to sustain a recognizable place within elite competition. In such a world, marriage was never just about affection. It was about maintaining one's position inside a relentless struggle for continuity and relevance. To understand why marriage mattered so much, we have to understand what the Roman household actually was. Modern people often imagine a family as parents and children, but Roman law and Roman social thought used familia in a much wider and more functional sense. It could mean not only spouses and children, but dependents, slaves, adopted members, and the broader household under a single legal authority. The Roman household was social, economic, legal, and symbolic all at once. It was a miniature order of command and dependence. This matters because marriage did not simply create companionship inside that household. It altered the configuration of that household. A marriage could enlarge a family's social capital, connect it to another lineage, and change the expectations surrounding inheritance and succession. It could even affect how a house was perceived by others in elite society. In Rome, reputation was not decorative. It was political currency. Noble families depended on memory, prestige, and a recognizable claim to honor. A good marriage could reinforce that claim. A poor one could weaken it. Among elites, therefore, marriage operated as a mechanism of placement. It signaled where a family stood, where it hoped to rise, and with whom it expected to move through the dangerous landscape of Roman public life. Scholars have described Roman elite marriage as a practice typically arranged between houses of equivalent standing and often aimed at concrete political advantage. The household also mattered because Roman politics was not organized around modern parties.
It worked through personal relationships, obligation, patronage, prestige, and networks of support.
Offices were public, but advancement was social. A man was helped not only by his talents, but by his family's standing, his alliances, his patrons, and the memory attached to his name. Marriage inserted new force into that web. It could connect houses that were already aligned and make them harder to separate. Or it could create a fresh channel between different branches of the elite. In that sense, a marriage was not an ornament to power. It was a conduit for power. This is also why Roman marriage can feel emotionally cold when described too briefly. If we reduce it to a political arrangement, we miss the texture. The marriage was political, not because Romans were incapable of affection, but because affection existed inside a system that assigned marriage broader work to do. A Roman noble marriage had to secure legitimacy, continuity, and alliance at the same time. It had to produce lawful children. It had to respect status expectations. It had to preserve honor. And, in many cases, it had to fit into a larger family strategy already in motion before the bride and groom had much say in the matter. That does not mean personal attachment was impossible. It means personal attachment was rarely the only question. At the center of the Roman household stood one of the most important figures in Roman social life, the paterfamilias, the male head of the family. Under the doctrine known as patria potestas, he exercised legal authority over his descendants in the male line and over those brought into the family by adoption. In its older and more extreme form, that power was famously broad, extending to control over property, and originally even severe power over the persons under his authority. Roman family law thus placed the household under a formal hierarchy in which the father's authority was foundational. This legal structure helps explain why marriage in Rome was never merely a private, romantic decision. A marriage could not be separated from the authority of the family that arranged, approved, or benefited from it. The union did not belong only to the couple. It belonged to the logic of the house. Fathers negotiated marriages because fathers were protecting and projecting the future of the family line. They were deciding where property would move, where loyalties would settle, and what kinds of descendants would carry the name forward. In elite contexts, such decisions were made with full awareness of status, influence, and political consequence. Betrothals could be arranged young, especially among the elite. And although in theory consent mattered, in practice, family strategy often dominated the process. This is where the emotional core of Roman marriage becomes more complex. The people at the center of the union were not always the primary authors of the union. A daughter of a noble house might be valued not simply for herself, but for what her marriage could secure between families. A son might be expected to marry in a way that advanced the interests of his line rather than his own private preference. The Roman aristocratic imagination was profoundly dynastic. It looked forward across generations. A marriage was judged not only by whether it pleased the present, but by whether it protected the future. And because the paterfamilias held both legal authority and symbolic responsibility for that future, marriage was folded into his sphere of control. Yet, it is important not to flatten Roman family life into a caricature of pure tyranny. The power of the paterfamilias was real.
But Roman households also depended on negotiation, persuasion, and mutual advantage.
The law gave one structure, social practice gave another. Families still needed cooperation. Brides still brought prestige and dowry. Sons still needed support. Daughters still carried value that could not simply be reduced to obedience.
That is precisely what made marriage such a potent institution. It sat at the point where law, kinship, and strategy met.
It was enforced by structure, but activated through relationships. To modern audiences, marriage is often imagined through feeling. Rome imagined it first through status and law. Roman marriage was not simply an emotional bond recognized by custom. It belonged to a legal world shaped by capacity, authority, and social classification. The right to contract a valid Roman marriage was tied to connubium, the legal capacity to marry under Roman law.
Roman law also distinguished between marriages with manus and marriages without manus.
In a marriage with manus, the wife came under the husband's authority, in a way analogous to the father's authority over children. In a marriage without manus, which became the more common form, the wife did not pass into the husband's legal power in the same way, and could remain under her father's potestas if he was still alive. These distinctions affected authority,
property, and the meaning of the union itself. That legal distinction reveals something crucial about Roman marriage. It was not one fixed, timeless institution.
It evolved, and the balance of power in husband
Could change.
In earlier forms of Roman practice, marriage could absorb a woman more completely into her husband's family.
But over time, marriage without manus became predominant, and that shift had real implications. It allowed a married woman's legal and property position to remain more distinct from her husband's household than we might expect from a simplistic picture of patriarchy.
In marriage without manus, the spouse's property remained distinct, and Roman law developed around those separations with striking sophistication. This legal complexity is one reason Roman marriage was so politically useful, because the law recognized different structures of authority and property. Marriage could be calibrated. It could be used to create alliance without total absorption. It could connect houses while preserving separate family interests. That made marriage ideal for an aristocratic society in which families wanted solidarity, but not annihilation. A noble house did not necessarily want to disappear into another house. It wanted connection, leverage, and continuity. Marriage without manus made that easier. It created a bond strong enough to matter, while allowing family identities, property interests to remain more clearly defined. The legal side of marriage also explains why Roman audiences would not have understood the phrase, just a love match, in the way modern audiences do. Even when affection existed, marriage still had to satisfy legal and social expectations. It had to produce legitimate heirs. It had to fit within status rules. It had to make sense to the family. A marriage was not real in Roman society simply because two people felt deeply about one another. It acquired full meaning because it sat inside a legal and familial order. Emotion could animate it. Law gave it structure. Family gave it purpose. Politics gave it consequence. No explanation of Roman marriage is complete without discussing money. Not because Rome was uniquely cynical, but because Roman marriage was inseparable from property. Dowry was one of the clearest examples of this. The bride's family typically transferred wealth as part of the marriage arrangement, and dowry became a crucial mechanism by which marriage linked households economically as well as socially. In legal practice, the treatment of dowry could matter greatly in the event of divorce, and Roman law developed procedures for its restoration. This meant that marriage was not simply about emotional or ceremonial union. It was an economic arrangement with the legal consequences. Why does that matter for your theme? Because economics is one of the deepest ways in which marriages quietly bound noble houses together. A political alliance based only on words could dissolve quickly. An alliance backed by kinship, children, dowry, and shared concern for reputation was far harder to undo cleanly. Marriage made abstract loyalty concrete. It attached names to property,
property to heirs, heirs to memory, and memory to future claims. In this sense, marriage turned alliance into infrastructure. The relationship did not survive only in a speech or agreement. It lived in estates, obligations, and descendants.
It is also important to see that property in Rome was never merely financial. Property was social weight. It made elite life possible. It sustained households, funded careers, displayed prestige, and underwrote the public image of nobility. A marriage that brought wealth could stabilize a declining line. A marriage that connected estates could strengthen a house's future resilience. A marriage that failed could trigger disputes not only of emotion, but of money, custody, inheritance, and standing. When Roman elites thought about marriage, they were therefore thinking not only about who belonged to whom, but about what remained intact across generations. This is one of the main reasons Roman marriage feels so strategic. It operated at the intersection of sentiment and survival. A noble house could not afford to treat marriage as a purely private gamble. Too much rested on it. A daughter's marriage was a movement of wealth and honor.
A son's marriage was an expansion or protection of lineage.
The household was both moral and material, and marriage reorganized both dimensions at once. The Romans may have celebrated family virtue and domestic order, but those ideals were inseparable from the practical question of how a house remained powerful, solvent, and remembered.
Among Rome's upper ranks, marriage was also a problem of status.
The Roman elite did not exist as a vague social class floating above the rest of society. It was a competitive and self-conscious order, in which ancestry, office, prestige, and public memory all mattered. By the Middle and Late Republic, nobility was not identical with patrician birth alone. Both patrician and plebeian families could belong to the nobility if they descended from consuls. This reminds us that elite identity in Rome was historical, political, and cumulative. It had to be maintained. Marriage was one of the main ways that maintenance happened. An aristocratic house
Did not merely want children. It wanted legitimate heirs who extended the house without diminishing it. It wanted marriages that matched or enhanced prestige. It wanted unions that would not make the family look desperate, diminished, or isolated.
Roman elite marriage therefore tended toward equivalence. Houses of standing married other houses of standing.
This was not just snobbery.
It was a means of preserving the symbolic economy of nobility. A great house had to appear worthy of its memory, and one way of doing that was to marry in a way that confirmed its place among peers.
Scholars have explicitly described Roman elite marriage as commonly contracted between noble houses of
Equivalent status, often with immediate political gains in view. Bloodline mattered here in several senses at once.
First, it mattered biologically. Marriage had to produce heirs.
Second, it mattered socially. Heirs carried names, and names carried political memory.
Third, it mattered that ideologically, Rome cared intensely about legitimacy, lineage, and continuity.
A family did not simply exist in the present. It existed as a chain. Ancestors validated the living, and the living were responsible for transmitting the house onward.
Marriage was the hinge on which that continuity turned.
Without it, the house could lose coherence. With a carefully arranged marriage, the house could renew itself.
This is also why Roman aristocratic marriage could become tense, even when outwardly successful.
Every union carried pressure. Would the bride produce heirs? Would the alliance hold? Would the children strengthen one branch of the family more than another? Would the union elevate one house while silently subordinating the other?
Roman marriage did not merely celebrate continuity. It exposed the anxiety behind continuity. Great houses married because they feared disappearance, just as much as they desired influence.
Beneath the ceremonial dignity
of aristocratic marriage was a stark question. Who will carry us forward, and at what costs? That question made every marriage larger than itself.
If we stop at the level of male ambition, we miss one of the most important truths about Roman marriage.
Women were not merely present in the system. They were the system's indispensable connectors.
Roman society was patriarchal,
and women lived within legal and ideological constraints.
Their expected role was closely tied to household management, chastity, and the bearing of legitimate children.
Yet precisely because Roman society placed so much value on lawful lineage and family continuity, elite women occupied a position of enormous dynastic importance.
An aristocratic daughter carried with her far more than personal identity. She carried the dignity of one house into another. Through her, a marriage became visible as an alliance. Through her children, lineage became embodied.
Through her conduct, the honor of multiple families could be reinforced or endangered.
In public memory, Roman women were often represented modestly, but in dynastic reality, they stood at the crossing point of ancestry, legitimacy, and succession.
A noble marriage did not merely place a woman somewhere else. It made her the medium through which relationships between houses were naturalized, humanized, and continued through birth.
This does not mean Roman women controlled
The structure, in a modern political sense.
Many did not choose the terms under which they were married, but it does mean that calling them just pawns is too shallow. A pawn is disposable. Roman noblewomen were not disposable. They were central to legitimacy. Without them, there were no lawful heirs, no dynastic continuity, no embodied alliance between families. In that sense, women in Roman aristocratic marriage were constrained actors, but they were still actors. The system limited them, yet also depended on them. And any system that depends on a group so completely cannot honestly describe that group as marginal. This is one of the deepest reasons marriage in Rome was never only marriage, because every elite wedding redistributed not only power among men, but meaning among families. It moved a woman across households, but in doing so it created continuity between them. She was expected to preserve memory, produce heirs, carry honor, and sometimes mediate ties that the men around her could not stabilize on their own. In the Roman imagination, the household was a place of order. In political reality, elite women often made that order durable. If Roman marriage had only been about sacred permanence, it would have been a less useful political tool. Part of what made it so powerful in practice was that it could be dissolved and remade. Roman law recognized divorce, and in marriage without manus, either party could end the relationship at will. This flexibility distinguished Roman marriage from many later traditions that treated marriage as nearly indissoluble. In Rome, a marriage could be formed to create alliance and later terminated when the alliance no longer served its purpose. That fact can sound brutally transactional to modern ears, but it reveals something essential about Roman elite culture. Marriage was designed to operate inside political reality, not outside it. Rome was a society of shifting fortunes, competitive ambition, and unstable alignments. If families were going to use marriage as a tool of survival, the institution had to be adaptable. Divorce and remarriage allowed elite houses to reposition themselves. New alliances could be forged. Broken alignments could be abandoned. A marriage was serious but not always final. It was a structure of commitment, yet also a device of recalibration. This adaptability did not make marriage trivial. On the contrary, it made marriage more deeply woven into power. Something becomes politically potent not only when it binds, but when it can be rebound. Roman marriages were meaningful because they connected law, family, property, and status. But they were also useful because those connections could be rearranged when circumstances changed. The same society that prized lineage also accepted strategic remaking. That tension sits at the heart of Roman aristocratic life. Continuity mattered enormously, but continuity often had to be protected through change. Marriage was one of the mechanisms through which that paradox was managed. So when we say marriage in Rome was political, we should not imagine a single dramatic conspiracy behind each wedding. The reality was more subtle and more pervasive. Marriage was political because it was one of the normal, respectable, legally recognized ways by which elite society organized itself. It created heirs, moved wealth, linked houses, shaped status, and could be reconfigured when needed. It was not outside politics. It was one of politics' most intimate forms. So why was marriage in Rome never just marriage? Because Rome did not build sharp walls between the personal and the political.
The household was a legal and social institution.
The father wielded formal authority. Property and dowry moved through marriage. Bloodline depended on lawful union. Noble status had to be preserved
Through strategic connection.
Women carried dynastic continuity across households.
And divorce itself made marriage a flexible instrument within a competitive elite order. Taken together, these features meant that a Roman marriage could never be reduced to private feeling alone.
It was always larger than the couple standing at its center. In Rome, a wedding was never simply the beginning of a household romance.
It was often the extension of a family strategy, the repair of a social bond, the protection of a status, or the first step in securing the next generation of influence.
Marriage linked law to emotion, ancestry to ambition, and domestic life to public power.
That is why it mattered so deeply. And that is why, before we look at famous families and specific alliances, we have to see marriage for what Rome saw it as, not an ornament to power, but one of its foundations.
In the Roman aristocratic world, marriage was never limited to the bride and groom.
A wedding linked households' reputations, inheritances, and futures.
Two individuals stood at the center of the ceremony. But the true union stretched far beyond them. It joined fathers, brothers,
Patrons, clients, ancestors, and heirs not yet born. This is what made marriage such a powerful social instrument. It created a relationship that was both intimate and public, personal and strategic.
A Roman nobleman did not merely gain a wife, he gained proximity to another family's influence. A Roman noblewoman did not simply
Leave one house for another. She carried the honor, memory, and political value of her birth family into a new domestic setting. That is why aristocratic marriage in Rome worked less like a modern romance and more like a carefully engineered bond.
It gave political relationships a human form.
It transformed abstract cooperation into family obligation.
And once that happened, the connection became harder to ignore, harder to dissolve, and far more meaningful than a temporary agreement between ambitious men.
Rome did not have political parties in the modern sense.
It had factions, friendships, rivalries, patronage networks, and strategic loyalties that shifted according to circumstance.
In such a world, trust was unstable. Alliances could be made in public, but they needed reinforcement in private. Marriage provided exactly that reinforcement. A marriage could stabilize an agreement that might otherwise remain fragile. It could reassure two families that their interests were now interwoven. What had once been a useful friendship could become kinship. And kinship in Roman society
Carried obligations that political convenience alone could not easily create.
This did not mean every marriage guaranteed loyalty.
Rome was too competitive, too ambitious, and too volatile for that.
But marriage raised the stakes. Once two houses were joined by marriage, disagreement no longer existed only between political actors. It moved into the realm of family. A breach of trust could now damage not only an alliance, but the honor and future of interconnected households. In that sense, a wedding often functioned as a quiet treaty. No public law needed to announce it.
No dramatic declaration was necessary.
The marriage itself was the signal. Rome's noble houses did not live in permanent harmony. They competed for office, prestige, and influence.
They fought for visibility in public life and for advantage in the Senate.
Rivalry was natural to the Roman elite.
But total hostility was dangerous, especially when powerful families needed each other at key moments.
Marriage could serve as a bridge across that danger. A carefully arranged union
Could soften suspicion without erasing ambition.
It could create a zone of shared interest between houses that might otherwise drift into confrontation.
Two families who became connected through marriage were not suddenly transformed into loyal friends, but they were bound by new considerations.
An attack on one could affect the standing of the other.
A public insult might now carry private consequences.
A political break could divide not only allies but relatives. This is one of the most fascinating things about Roman aristocratic marriage. It did not eliminate conflict,
but it could delay it, redirect it, or make it more complicated. Marriage did not heal the Roman elite of its competitive instincts.
What it did was place those instincts inside a web of obligations that made open rupture more costly.
And sometimes that was enough to preserve an uneasy peace.
For the Roman aristocracy,
Status was never passive. It had to be defended, displayed, and renewed.
a great family could not simply rely on its ancestors forever. It had to keep proving that it belonged among the elite.
Marriage was one of the main ways this happened.
To marry well was to
Confirm one's place in the social order.
A marriage between noble houses signaled parity, respectability, and continuing relevance.
It told the Roman world that this family still mattered, still had value, still belonged within the circle of houses that counted.
This mattered even more in a competitive system where public memory was everything.
Roman elites were always aware of names, lineages, and the prestige attached to office-holding ancestors.
Marriage could preserve that prestige by ensuring that a family remained linked to others of similar weight. It could also rescue a family in a weaker moment, giving it renewed connection to stronger allies and helping prevent social decline. In this way, marriage was not only about ambition, it was also about defense. Some families married to rise, others married to avoid falling, and often both motives existed at once. Roman society,
Caesar admired ancestry, but it wasn't completely closed.
New men and rising families could achieve prominence, especially through office, wealth, and political skill. Yet, gaining influence was not the same as gaining full acceptance.
Power alone did not automatically produce deep social legitimacy. That often required connection to established houses.
Marriage helped make that possible. For a rising family,
marriage into an older or more respected line could offer more than prestige.
It could grant access to memory,
status, and social recognition that money or talent alone could not fully secure.
It could make ambition look settled rather than disruptive. It could help transform success into belonging.
For the older family, the arrangement could be useful as well.
An ancient name might benefit from fresh resources, new political strength, or renewed momentum.
Marriage thus allowed different kinds of power to meet.
One house might offer deep ancestry. Another might bring energy, money, or current influence. Joined together, they could strengthen one another. This is one of the reasons Roman marriage was so effective as a political tool. It did not simply preserve the existing order. It also managed change within that order. It helped Rome absorb new power without completely abandoning old prestige. When two houses were joined through marriage, that alliance did not remain abstract. It had to be lived, and very often, it was the woman at the center of the marriage who made that connection real. A daughter of one noble family entered another not as a blank individual, but as the embodied link between two worlds. Her presence made the alliance visible. Her children gave it continuity. Her conduct could strengthen trust, preserve dignity, and sustain ties between households that might otherwise weaken.
This is why Roman noblewomen were so central to the functioning of aristocratic politics,
even if they did not hold office in the formal male sphere. Through them, houses were connected
emotionally, socially, and dynastically.
Through them, a marriage moved beyond arrangement and became part of lived family reality.
To say that women were merely exchanged between houses is too simple.
They were not only moved, they also carried meaning. They bore the burden of alliance, but also its permanence. A marriage could be negotiated by men, but it often became durable through the woman who stood at its center. That is one of the quiet truths of Roman power. Some of its most important bridges were carried by women whose names appear in history less loudly than the men around them. Marriage created a connection. Children deepened it. Once a union produced heirs, the relationship between two houses became more than a present arrangement. It extended into the future. Property, ancestry, inheritance, and identity now converged in living descendants. A child could represent not only family continuity, but the fusion of two noble lines and the promise of influence carried forward. This is why children mattered so profoundly in Roman aristocratic marriage. They were not simply symbols of domestic success. They were the human proof that an alliance had taken root. Through them, two families became entangled in ways that were much harder to reverse. Even if political relations later changed, the child remained. Bloodline remained. Shared interest remained. This did not guarantee peace. Rome offers many examples of kinship failing to prevent rivalry.
But children complicated any clean separation.
They made political breaks more painful and more consequential.
To divide after such a marriage was not merely to abandon an agreement.
It was to fracture a connection that had already entered the next generation. In this sense, heirs were one of the deepest ways in marriage bound noble houses together. They gave alliance a future.
When people imagine the forces that held Rome together, they usually think of law, conquest, military discipline, or political institutions.
All of those mattered, but beneath those visible systems was another kind of cohesion, one far quieter and often overlooked: the web of marriages that linked the elite to itself. These marriages helped reduce uncertainty in a competitive world. They gave powerful houses reasons to cooperate, even when trust was incomplete.
They made public alliances more intimate and private loyalties more politically significant.
They connected families across generations,
distributed prestige, and created a kind of social fabric that violence alone could not produce.
This is what makes the phrase quietly bound so powerful.
These marriages did not announce themselves as the foundation of Roman stability.
They rarely became the center of public memory in the same way battles did, yet they shaped the environment in which politics unfolded. They influenced who trusted whom, who stood with whom, and whose children would inherit both blood and ambition.
Rome was not held together only by what happened in the forum or on campaign. It was also held together by what happened in households, at banquet tables, during negotiations between fathers, and in unions that seemed so domestic, but were never merely so.
Once we understand marriage as a bridge between noble houses, the larger story of Rome begins to look different. Alliances that seem purely political reveal a family dimension. Rivalries that appear sudden begin to show older fractures beneath them, and certain famous marriages begin to look less like side notes to history and more like turning points concealed in domestic form. Because in Rome, a wedding could do what speeches alone could not. It could bind power to blood, and nowhere is that clearer than in the unions surrounding the late Republic, where marriage did not merely reflect political alliance, but helped create, sustain, and eventually expose its breaking points.
By 59 BCE, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had formed the political arrangement, later known as the First Triumvirate.
It was not a formal constitutional office, and that was precisely the problem. The alliance rested on mutual advantage, not on law. Caesar needed backing for his consulship and future command. Pompey wanted settlements confirmed and his position secured. Crassus wanted his own interests protected. Each man was powerful, but each also had reason to distrust the others. In a system like that, shared ambition was not enough. Rome's politics was too unstable, too personal, and too competitive for a major alliance to rely on convenience alone. It needed reinforcement.
It needed something that could make political cooperation feel heavier, more binding, and harder to abandon.
That is where marriage entered the picture. So when Pompey married Julia, Caesar's only daughter, the union did more than decorate an existing partnership. It gave the alliance a human center. It turned cooperation into kinship. It transformed a strategic arrangement into something that could be felt inside the structure of family itself. Britannica explicitly describes Pompey's marriage to Julia as sealing his alliance with Caesar. It is easy, from a distance, to let Julia fade into the background of the larger names around her. Caesar dominates the story. Pompey dominates the story. Even Crassus looms as part of the political triangle.
But Julia matters because she was the point at which alliance became family.
Her marriage was not incidental to the politics of the moment. It was one of the mechanisms by which those politics were stabilized. This is exactly the kind of thing your video is about. Rome's ruling world often depended on bonds that looked domestic, but were never merely domestic. Julia was Caesar's daughter, yes, but in political terms, she also became the living bridge between Caesar and Pompey. Through her, the alliance acquired intimacy. Through her, trust was no longer purely transactional. Through her, Two of the most consequential men in Rome became connected, not only by interest but by household. That did not mean Julia had sovereign political power in the formal sense, but it did mean the marriage carried enormous symbolic and strategic weight.
In Rome, a daughter of Caesar married to Pompey was never just a wife in a famous household.
She was the embodiment of a pact. Political alliances can be broken. Family bonds can also be broken, but they are harder to treat casually. That is why this marriage mattered so much. Once Pompey married Julia,
Any breach between him and Caesar would no longer be a simple disagreement between ambitious men.
it would become a fracture inside a family connection.
That raised the emotional, social, and reputational cost of rupture.
This is one of the deepest truths about Roman elite marriage. It gave politics a domestic form. The Roman aristocracy did not separate public strategy from family life, the way modern people often do.
To marry was to bind households, and once households were bound, power had a more intimate architecture. That architecture did not guarantee loyalty, but it made loyalty feel thicker.
It placed ambition inside obligation.
So the Caesar-Pompey connection was not held together only by mutual benefit. It was also held together by Julia's presence at its center. She represented a kind of soft cohesion, less visible than a law, less dramatic than a battle, but powerful, precisely because it was human. For Caesar, the marriage helped secure one of the most important political relationships of his career at a critical moment.
His consulship in 59 BCE and his subsequent command in Gaul depended on a durable coalition. The alliance with Pompey and Crassus gave him room to act. Binding Pompey through marriage helped make that coalition more resilient.
For Pompey, the union also hid clear value. Britannica notes that Pompey saw Caesar as his necessary instrument during this period.
That does not mean he was subordinate. It means the alliance served real needs. Pompey had immense prestige, but prestige alone did not remove political obstacles in Rome. A familial link with Caesar strengthened the compact and tied Pompey to a man who was about to accumulate military glory and long-term command.
And that is what makes the marriage so revealing.
It was not sentimental decoration around power.
It was part of the machinery of power.
The wedding helped secure a coalition that reshaped Roman politics.
Julia died in
54 BCE, and ancient Rome lost more than a prominent aristocratic woman.
Caesar and Pompey lost the personal tie that had helped keep their alliance from becoming purely strategic.
Britannica is unusually direct on this point. The marriage link between Caesar and Pompey was broken by Julia's death. Other Britannica entries likewise note that her death dissolved Pompey's bond with Caesar within the decade. That wording matters.
It tells us how seriously ancient and modern interpreters alike have taken the political function of the marriage.
Julia's death did not cause the civil war by itself. Rome's crisis was much larger than one personal loss, but
her death removed one of the soft restraints that had made total estrangement more difficult.
Once she was gone, the alliance had less human glue holding it together.
This is exactly why marriages mattered in Rome. Their power was not always loud. It was structural, emotional, and connective. The marriage could steady a partnership, not because it erased conflict, but because it made conflict more costly.
When Julia died, that cost changed. The story of Caesar, Pompey, and Julia is powerful precisely because it resists simplistic romance. The marriage mattered enormously, but it did not transform Rome into a world of harmony. Ambition remained, competition remained.
The structural tensions inside the late Republic remained.
Caesar was gaining military prestige in Gaul. Pompey remained a towering figure in Roman politics. Crassus, the third member of the alliance, would die in 53 BCE, removing yet another stabilizing piece from the arrangement.
So the lesson here is not that one marriage could permanently secure Rome.
The lesson is subtler. A marriage could create a zone of temporary cohesion inside a dangerous political order.
It could give rivals reasons to cooperate longer than they otherwise might have.
It could hold together a balance that law itself had not fully secured, but it could not erase the underlying struggle for dominance.
That distinction is crucial for your theme. Roman marriages were powerful not because they eliminated ambition, but because they were one of the few tools capable of containing ambition for a time.
After Julia's death, Pompey gradually moved further away from Caesar. Britannica notes that after the marriage link was broken, Pompey veered further and further from Caesar until he ultimately found himself committed to the side of the nobility, even if trust there was imperfect. That phrasing captures the drift well. Not an instant reversal, but a deepening separation. The wider collapse of the alliance eventually led to the Roman Civil War. Caesar crossed into Italy. Pompey became his great rival, and the conflict culminated in decisive confrontations, such as Pharsalus in 48 BCE. By then, whatever had once been secured through marriage had long since given way to open struggle. And that is the tragic force of this case study. The same Rome that used marriage to bind power to blood could still end in bloodshed. The marriage had mattered. It had helped hold the alliance together. But once the connective tissue was gone, the Republic's larger fractures reasserted themselves with extraordinary violence. The marriage of Pompey and Julia reveals, in concentrated form, how Rome actually worked. First, it shows that elite marriage was not secondary to politics. It was one of politics' operating tools. Second, it shows that women in aristocratic marriages could stand at the center of major political alignments, even when later narratives pushed them to the margins. Third, it shows that Rome's greatest crises were shaped not only by institutions and armies, but by the fragile human bonds inside elite families. Most importantly, this case shows what your title means by quietly bound. Julia did not command legions. Her marriage did not look like a constitutional reform. Yet that union helped hold together one of the most important political partnerships in the late Republic. And when that bond was broken, Rome moved closer to catastrophe. A wedding, in other words, did what a treaty sometimes could not. It made power personal. If Caesar, Pompey, and Julia show how marriage could stabilize a political alliance during the last years of the Republic, the next great shift in Roman history shows something even larger. Marriage could be used not just to preserve power, but to design a dynasty. Because after the chaos of civil war, Rome would move into a new era, one in which marriage was no longer only a tool of aristocratic cooperation, but a method of shaping succession itself. When Octavian, we'll say the future Augustus, emerged from the chaos of civil war, was inherited more than victory. He inherited a Roman world exhausted by rivalry, shattered by broken loyalties, and haunted by the collapse of the Republic. The old political language still existed, but trust in the old order had been deeply damaged. This is what makes Augustus such an important turning point in your story. In the late Republic, marriage had often functioned as a way to bind powerful houses together inside an unstable aristocratic system. But under Augustus, marriage began to serve an even larger purpose. It was no longer only about maintaining cooperation among elites. It became part of the structure through which a new political order could present itself as stable, moral, and continuous. In other words, Augustus did not simply inherit Rome. He had to rebuild the meaning of power itself. And in that reconstruction, family became one of his most important tools. Under the Republic, marriage often supported faction, ambition, or aristocratic partnership. Under Augustus, it still did those things. But now, it also helped define the shape of rule. This was a crucial shift. Augustus could not openly call himself a king. Roman political culture was too deeply suspicious of monarchy. His power had to be framed carefully, clothed in the language of restoration, duty, and order. That meant the ruler's household could not look like a private family in the ordinary sense. It had to become something larger, a visible model of continuity, discipline, and legitimacy. Marriage, therefore, became more than a bond between houses. It became part of dynastic architecture. Who married whom now mattered not only because of aristocratic alliance, but because these unions could hint at succession, signal favor, and connect branches of the ruling family into something resembling a stable governing structure. A marriage in the Augustan world could feel almost constitutional without ever being officially called that. That is one of the quiet revolutions of the early empire.
Private family arrangements began to carry public meaning on an entirely new scale.
One of Augustus's greatest achievements was that he made his household politically meaningful, without always making it look overtly political. He understood that Rome, after so much bloodshed, needed more than force. It needed an image of order. The imperial household helped provide that image. In earlier aristocratic politics, marriage linked one noble house to another. Under Augustus, the ruler's family itself became the center around which elite connection could be organized.
Marriage now radiated outward from the imperial household, creating relationships that did not simply reflect power but helped arrange it.
This is why the Augustan family should not be seen as background to politics.
It was part of politics.
Its marriages could elevate individuals,
Draw branches of the elite into closer relation with the regime, and shape expectations about who stood nearest the future. What had once been an aristocratic web became under Augustus something more centralized.
The family of the ruler
Became a mechanism through which Rome's governing order could be imagined as hereditary, moral, and stable, even in a state that officially denied monarchy.
That tension is at the heart of
Augustan rule. Rome insisted it was not a kingdom, yet power increasingly
moved through a household that looked dynastic in everything but name.
If Augustus built political order through family,
then women were indispensable to that construction. This is one of the most important truths of the early empire. Women in the imperial family were not simply decorative symbols of domestic virtue. They were the living links through which
Augustus could bind branches of power together, organize succession, and give the regime a sense of bloodline continuity. Their marriages mattered because they connected names, households, and future heirs.
Through them, the ruling house extended itself. That is why women under Augustus cannot be understood merely as passive figures hidden behind male authority. They were constrained by the world they lived in, but they were also central to how that world reproduced itself.
Marriage made them vital to the language of legitimacy. A daughter, wife, widow, or mother in the imperial household could become the hinge on which political meaning turned.
Her marriage could imply alliance. Her children could imply succession. Her body, in effect, became part of the state's argument for continuity. That is both of the power
and the burden of dynastic womanhood in Rome. Women could stand near the center of history while being described in public ideology as if they stood quietly at its edge.
Force can win a state.
It cannot by itself make rule feel natural.
Augustus understood this better than most Roman leaders before him. He had risen through violence, maneuver, and civil conflict, but he could not leave Rome permanently in the atmosphere of emergency. He needed his rule to feel settled. He needed it to feel not like domination alone, but like order restored.
Marriage helped him do that.
A ruler's family,
carefully arranged and visibly respectable, could suggest permanence.
It could transform power from
something seized into something inherited, transmitted, and therefore less shocking.
Marriage linked the present ruler to the future,
and the future to recognizable bloodlines. It made political continuity appear domestic, almost organic.
This is why dynastic marriage is so important in imperial Rome. It gave legitimacy a human face. Instead of speaking
only through decrees, armies, and titles, the regime could speak through sons-in-law, daughters, heirs, mothers, and wives.
It could present itself not simply as a machine of command, but as a household with continuity. That did not make it less political. It made it more persuasive. Marriage, in this sense, was one of the tools by which Augustus softened the appearance of one-man rule without surrendering control of it. One of the deepest structural problems Augustus faced was succession. How do you found a new order in a state that distrusts kingship?
How do you prepare for the future without openly admitting that your power is dynastic?
This was not a problem that military strength could solve on its own. Armies could secure Augustus in the present, but they could not automatically settle the question of who should follow him. That required a language of continuity. And marriage was one of the clearest ways to build that language.
By arranging and managing family connections, Augustus could create a framework in which certain individuals appeared closer to a sense of legitimacy than others.
Marriage
helped define proximity. It established relational hierarchy. It suggested who belonged inside the ruling design and who stood outside it. This is what makes Augustan marriage feel so architectonic.
These unions were not merely reactions to immediate need.
They were structural placements. They helped create the internal map of the ruling household. And because Rome had not fully formalized succession, those family placements mattered enormously.
A marriage could quietly suggest tomorrow's power before tomorrow officially arrived.
Augustus understood that political chaos often begins where social order fails.
After decades of civil war, Rome needed not only peace, but a moral narrative to accompany peace. The regime, therefore, presented itself as a force of restoration, not just of government, but of Roman values.
Family was central to that message. Marriage, childbearing, lineage, and domestic discipline, these were not simply private virtues in the Augustan imagination.
They were tied to the health of the state.
The ruler's household became the most visible stage on which those values could be dramatized. If the imperial family appeared stable, fertile, honorable, and properly ordered, the regime itself could claim to embody renewal. This is one of the subtler ways marriage functioned under Augustus. It was not just a private bond or aristocratic alliance. It became part of political theater, but theater with real structural consequences. The family of the ruler was expected to symbolize the order he claimed to have restored. Yet it was also expected to produce the heirs, alliances, and internal coherence necessary to sustain that order. So marriage operated on two levels at once, as image and as mechanism. That dual role made it extraordinarily powerful. And yet, for all its usefulness, dynastic marriage carried its own dangers. The more a regime depended on family ties, the more vulnerable it became to family complications.
Marriage could strengthen succession,
but it could also create rivalry. It could generate coherence, but also resentment. It could bind branches of the ruling house together, while silently raising questions about rank, inheritance, and favor.
This is the paradox of Augustan family politics.
The household was supposed to project stability, but because so much meaning was placed upon it, every marriage, birth, death, and remarriage became politically charged.
What looked like domestic life was never merely domestic.
It was saturated with implication. A successful marriage could make the dynastic design look elegant.
A failed one could expose how fragile that design really was. A well-placed heir could stabilize the future. The loss of that heir could force the entire architecture to be reconsidered. So even as Augustus used marriage to construct the image of permanence, marriage also reminded Rome how uncertain permanence could be. To understand the full depth of this system, we have to move closer to one of the most important figures in the Augustan world. Livia.
Because if Augustus used marriage to build the architecture of alliance, Livia stood near the center of that architecture, not only as wife, but as dynastic connector, maternal presence, and symbol of continuity.
Through her, we begin to see even more clearly how Roman women could shape the logic of power without ever formally ruling in the way men did.
When Livia Drusilla entered the world of Octavian, the future Augustus, she did not enter it as a passive figure in the background of a rising ruler.
She entered it carrying lineage, connections, and a future that would become inseparable from the making of the imperial household. Born in 58 BCE, Livia came from one of Rome's old aristocratic circles, and when she married Octavian in 38 BCE, she brought with her not only prestige, but also the complex political weight of her earlier marriage and existing family ties.
Britannica notes that she was already pregnant with Drusus when she divorced Tiberius Claudius Nero and married Octavian, a fact that immediately made the union politically and socially striking. That detail matters because it shows, once again, how Roman marriage could absorb and reorganize political reality, rather than simply reflect domestic feeling.
Livia was not joining an ordinary household. She was entering the center of a new order still in the making. Octavian was consolidating power after years of civil war, and the household he built would eventually become the symbolic core of the Principate.
Livia therefore mattered from the beginning, not simply because she was Augustus's wife, but because her presence helped give shape to what that household would become.
In that sense, Livia belongs perfectly inside your larger theme. She was not merely married into power. She stood at the point where marriage, lineage, and political construction met. The marriage between Octavian and Livia was not only a personal union. It joined two aristocratic trajectories and helped widen the social base of Octavian's position. Britannica's summary of Augustus specifically notes that Octavian's marriage to Livia helped him win over nobles who had previously supported Antony. That is an important clue. The marriage had political reach beyond the household itself. Livia brought with her Claudian connections, and this mattered in a Roman world where old family prestige still carried enormous weight. Octavian, brilliant as he was still a new kind of ruler, trying to stabilize his place after revolution. By marrying Livia,
he did not simply take a wife of rank.
He helped connect his future regime to older aristocratic legitimacy.
The marriage therefore worked on two levels at once. It bound Augustus to a woman who would become central to his household, and it linked his emerging power to the traditional prestige of established Roman nobility.
This is why Livia's story matters so much. Her marriage shows that in Rome, women could stand at the crossing point between old legitimacy and new power. She helped make a revolutionary regime look rooted rather than improvised. Augustus did not rule by force alone. He ruled through image, order, and the careful presentation of moral seriousness. That meant his household had to appear disciplined, dignified, and worthy of imitation. In that setting, Livia became far more than a spouse. She became one of the most important female symbols of the Augustan regime. Britannica describes Augustus's devotion to Livia as constant, and the longevity and visibility of their marriage helped present the ruler's household as stable and honorable.
At a time when Augustus was promoting moral legislation and presenting himself as the restorer of Roman values, Livia's public image mattered enormously.
She could embody restraint, domestic virtue, and continuity, all qualities the regime wanted associated with itself. This symbolic role should not be underestimated. Regimes do not survive only through laws and armies, they also survive through believable narratives. Livia helped make Augustus's narrative believable. She gave the imperial household a feminine center that looked ordered, respectable, and enduring. In a society trying to imagine one-man rule as compatible with Roman tradition, that image was politically invaluable.
So when we speak of Livia as a female center of power, we should not imagine power only in the narrow sense of issuing commands.
She exercised another kind of power: representational power, moral power, dynastic power. The power to make a regime look natural.
One of the most fascinating things about Livia is that she occupied the space where household life and statecraft blurred into one another.
Britannica states directly that she counseled Augustus on affairs of state. Whether we imagine that advice as constant or selective, the point is clear. She was not confined to an ornamental role. She stood close enough to the center of rule to participate in the intellectual and strategic atmosphere of government. That is exactly the kind of influence Roman women could exercise when formal office was closed to them. They often did not rule publicly,
but they could shape access, intimacy, mood, persuasion, and continuity within the ruling household.
In Rome, proximity to power mattered. To be trusted inside the household of the ruler was not a minor thing. It meant inhabiting the zone
where private conversation could carry public consequence.
Livia's importance therefore lay partly in her position.
She was neither outside politics nor visibly inside it in the way a magistrate or general was.
She occupied the in-between space, the domestic center from which dynastic politics could be stabilized, moderated, and given emotional coherence.
That is why she is so important to your argument.
She shows that in Rome, some of the deepest mechanisms of power
operated through people who stood beside the throne, rather than upon it.
Livia's dynastic importance becomes even clearer when we remember that she brought 2 sons from her earlier marriage into Augustus's orbit, Tiberius and Drusus. Britannica notes that after the death of Agrippa in 12 BCE, Livia was able to persuade Augustus to favor her sons as possible successors, and Augustus compelled Tiberius to marry Julia, his own daughter, in 11 BCE. This is one of the clearest examples in Roman history of marriage being used as dynastic architecture. This detail reveals something essential about Livia's place in the imperial household.
She was not only Augustus's wife, she was also the maternal source of an alternative dynastic line.
Through her sons, the future of the regime could be redirected.
Through her, the Claudian bloodline moved inward, toward the center of Julian power. That fusion would eventually become one of the defining features of the Julio-Claudian house itself. And this is where the title of your video becomes especially resonant. Marriage quietly bound Rome's noble houses together, but in Livia's case, it did more than bind houses. It helped bind dynasties. Through her marriage to Augustus, and through the placement of her sons within the succession struggle, the future of imperial Rome was being shaped inside the family.
Modern viewers often search history for explicit acts of command.
Who gave the order? Who held the office? Who made the law?
But Roman elite politics, especially inside the imperial household, often worked through subtler forms of influence. Council access, intimacy, timing, placement, persuasion.
Livia's importance
reminds us to widen our definition of power. Britannica calls her influential and reports the long-standing tradition that she worked to secure the succession for Tiberius. Whether one accepts every ancient accusation made against her is another matter. Many of those stories emerged from
hostile or sensational traditions. But even the persistence of such stories tells us something. Romans themselves understood that a woman in Livia's position could matter enormously. They believed the imperial household was a site where succession could be shaped, and they believed Livia stood near its center. So even when the evidence must be handled carefully,
the broader truth remained strong. Livia's influence was real enough that both ancient writers and later historians treated her as a major factor in dynastic politics.
That alone tells us how deeply marriage and motherhood could place a woman inside the Roman structure of power. Livia's legacy is surrounded by rumor,
especially the tradition that she removed rivals to clear the way for Tiberius.
Britannica reflects this by noting that she was reputed to have caused the deaths of several potential rivals, while also presenting that claim as part of her historical image, rather than uncontested fact. That distinction is important.
For your script, the most useful point is not whether every rumor is true.
It is why such rumors attached to her so powerfully in the first place.
They attached to her because Roman society was uneasy about hidden influence.
A woman who stood close to the ruler, who had dynastic interests through her son, and who occupied the moral center of the regime was bound to attract suspicion.
Livia became a screen onto which Roman anxieties about succession, household politics, and female power could be projected.
The more central she was,
the easier it became to imagine her as manipulative, calculating, or dangerously effective.
This is one of the most revealing aspects of her story. Rome could not ignore women like Livia because dynastic rule made them indispensable. But it also struggled to describe powerful women without turning them into objects of fear.
That tension tells us a great deal about how imperial politics actually worked.
When Augustus died in 14 CE, Livia's place in the regime changed once again. She was adopted into the Julian family and received the name Julia Augusta, a transformation that symbolically completed what her marriage had long been doing politically. She was no longer merely the wife beside Augustus. She was inscribed into the dynastic identity of the ruling house itself.
This moment is deeply important for your theme.
It shows marriage reaching its fullest Roman meaning.
Livia's union with Augustus had not only connected households in the ordinary aristocratic sense.
Over time, it helped fuse bloodlines, shape succession, and redefine the imperial family. Her final elevation into the Julian line made visible what had already been true. In practice, she had become one of the central pillars of Rome's dynastic order. So when we look at Livia, we are not looking at a side character in the age of Augustus. We are looking at one of the clearest examples of how a Roman woman could stand at the female center of power. Not through office, but through marriage, lineage, household authority, maternal strife, and symbolic permanence.
Livia shows us that marriage in Rome was never only about alliance between houses.
At the highest level, it could become the framework through which an entire regime imagined continuity. Through one woman, the worlds of aristocratic marriage, maternal ambition, public morality, and dynastic succession all came together. But Livia's story also points toward a darker truth. The same marriages that could stabilize Rome could also conceal strain. They could project harmony while carrying rivalry inside them. They could hold a regime together in one generation and complicate it in the next. By now, one thing should be clear. Marriage in Rome mattered enormously. It created alliance, softened rivalry, carried legitimacy, and gave political structures a human form. But it had limits. Marriage could bind power. It could not cure ambition. That is the essential tragedy at the heart of Roman aristocratic life. The same elite world that relied on marriage to secure trust was also driven by competition so intense that no family bond could fully contain it. Noble houses married one another to create stability, yet they remained trapped in a culture that rewarded advancement, prestige, and dominance. Every alliance contained its own tension, because every alliance linked people who still wanted more. This is why Roman marriage is so fascinating. It was not naive. It was never meant to create a world without rivalry. It was meant to manage rivalry, to make ambition livable, to wrap conflict inside kinship, to give the Roman elite a way of coexisting without constant collapse. But management is not the same as resolution. And sooner or later, Rome always rediscovered that difference. Roman politics was rarely stable for long. Even under powerful leaders, alliances remained vulnerable to death, succession, scandal, shifting loyalty, and fear. The Roman ruling class lived in an atmosphere where rank mattered, memory mattered, and proximity to power mattered. In that environment, marriage could strengthen a relationship, but it could also become one more site of anxiety. A marriage between noble houses did not exist outside the pressure of politics. It absorbed that pressure. If one branch of the family gained too much influence, suspicion could grow. If heirs were uncertain, tension could rise. If a spouse died, the balance could shift. If favor changed to the top, a previously useful marriage could become an awkward reminder of yesterday's strategy. This is especially important for your theme, because it prevents the story from becoming too elegant. Marriage was not a magical system of hidden order operating beneath Rome. It was a tool used within a harsh and unstable world. Sometimes it worked beautifully. Sometimes it only postponed a break that was already coming. Rome's noble houses understood the value of marriage precisely because they lived in a world where nothing else felt secure enough. That fragility is what gives these unions their emotional weight. It showed how Julia's marriage to Pompey helped hold together Caesar's alliance. It also showed the limit of such a bond. The marriage mattered. It humanized politics. It made separation harder. But it did not remove the structural conflict that eventually led Rome toward civil war. That pattern repeats across Roman history. Marriage could delay confrontation because it imposed costs on open hostility. It made conflict more tangled, more personal, and more dangerous to pursue carelessly. But when ambition intensified, when succession became urgent, or when political pressure rose beyond a certain point, family connection could cease to restrain. It might even deepen the pain of rupture. That is one of the cruel paradoxes of Roman elite life. The stronger the bond, the sharper the fracture when it failed. A marriage could create years of stability. It could make cooperation possible between houses that would otherwise distrust each other. Yet if the underlying conflict remained unresolved, the eventual break could be even more dramatic, because now was no longer just political. It had become familial. And family betrayal, in Rome as elsewhere,
carried its own special violence.
Under Augustus, marriage became part of dynastic architecture. It helped make a new regime look orderly, moral, and continuous. But dynastic design can be deceptive.
What appears stable from the outside may be under enormous pressure within.
This is where Rome's ruling family becomes especially revealing. The imperial household was supposed to symbolize harmony, continuity, and legitimate succession. Yet the more meaning Rome placed on that household, the more every marriage inside it became politically charged. A union was no longer simply a family matter. It became a sign. It suggested who mattered, who stood close to the future, and whose line might shape the next generation.
That is a tremendous weight to place upon marriage.
A marriage made for dynastic stability could conceal competition between branches of the family. It could hide resentments behind ceremony. It could present a surface of order while anxiety deepened underneath.
If succession later changed, the same marriage that once appeared central could be reinterpreted as a failed
design, an abandoned hope, or a dangerous complication. This is why dynastic marriage in Rome was both useful and fragile. It made power look hereditary and structured,
but it also exposed how uncertain the future remained.
The marriage could symbolize continuity. It could not guarantee it. At the aristocratic level, marriage linked houses. At the imperial level, marriage could shape the question of who might one day rule.
And once that happened, the stakes changed dramatically.
A marriage tied to succession was never neutral.
It could elevate one person without formally naming them.
It could signal favor without public declaration. It could place an individual
close to the center of legitimacy simply by association.
And because Rome often lacked a clean,
universally accepted system of succession, these family placements mattered enormously.
But the closer marriage came to the problem of succession, the more it attracted rivalry. Every possible heir implied disappointment for someone else. Every dynastic union could strengthen one branch while weakening another. A wife, daughter, mother, or widow
might suddenly become politically significant, not because she held office, but because she stood near the path by which future power would move.
That is when marriage ceased to be merely connective and became explosive. What had once linked families together could now divide them.
The same institution that created order could become a theater of competition.
The same household that promised continuity could become the site where Rome's future was quietly contested. In that sense, dynastic marriage did not merely fail sometimes. It created the conditions under which failure could become historically catastrophic. One of the most poignant truths in this story is the role of women. Roman noble women were often expected to carry alliance, continuity, dignity, and legitimacy, all at once.
Through marriage, they connected houses.
Through childbirth, they extended bloodlines. Through conduct, they upheld the honor of families and regimes. And yet, the larger political outcomes of those marriages were often beyond their control. This tension is especially important because it keeps us from telling the story too mechanically. Women in Rome were not merely exchanged objects, but neither were they fully sovereign architects of the system they inhabited. They were indispensable to dynastic politics, yet frequently unable to direct the larger ambitions that passed through them. That is part of what makes Roman marriage feel tragic, as well as strategic. A woman could embody peace between houses and still be powerless to stop those houses from turning against each other. She could bear heirs intended to secure stability, only to see succession become more contested because of those very heirs. She could stand at the center of political meaning while remaining vulnerable to scandal, suspicion, and retrospective blame. Rome relied on women to make continuity possible. But Rome did not always allow those women to define what continuity would mean. That imbalance sits at the emotional core of aristocratic marriage in the Roman world. When marriages failed in Rome, the failure was rarely confined to the household. Because these unions were tied to property, reputation, alliance, and legitimacy, their breakdown could expose deeper fractures already running through the political order. A divorce, a death, a dynastic collapse, or a disputed union could all function like a crack in the wall. Not the source of instability, but the moment instability became visible.
This is what makes Roman marriage such a revealing lens. It shows us where the structure is under strain. When a key bond breaks, we begin to see how much had been resting on it. A marriage that once appeared ornamental suddenly reveals itself as foundational. A wife who once seemed marginal suddenly appears as the carrier of legitimacy. A child who once symbolized continuity suddenly becomes the focus of conflict. And at that moment, Rome's private world stops looking private at all.
This is why marriage matters so much as a historical subject.
It is not merely a side story to the real politics of Rome. Often it is the place where Rome's real tensions become legible. The household becomes the mirror in which the state can see its own fragility. In the end, marriage could not save Rome, because Rome had become too vast, too unequal, too ambitious, and too unstable to be held together by kinship alone. Held together, marriage could help organize the elite. It could make power more intimate. It could soften competition, channel succession, and attach emotional weight to political relationships. But it could not replace institutions. It could not permanently solve constitutional ambiguity. It could not remove the violence built into elite rivalry. And it could not guarantee that one generation's carefully arranged order would survive the next. That is the ultimate limit of aristocratic marriage in Roman history. It was powerful because Rome depended so heavily on family, status, and lineage. But precisely for that reason, it was never enough. The larger the political system became, the more marriage could only supplement power, not stabilize it completely. This is why the story feels both intimate and immense. On one level, we are talking about households, daughters, weddings, heirs, and widows. On another, we are talking about the survival of a civilization that increasingly asks private bonds to carry public burdens they could not fully bear. Marriage could bind Rome's noble houses together. It could not guarantee that Rome itself would remain unbroken. And that is what makes these marriages so historically powerful. They were never trivial. They were never merely decorative. They helped shape alliances, secure legitimacy, and carry the future across generations. They mattered because Rome made them matter. But they also reveal the limits of elite control. Even that the most carefully arranged union could not fully master death, ambition, resentment, rivalry, or the uncertainty of succession. The marriage that bound Rome's ruling houses together were real, sometimes beautiful, sometimes strategic, sometimes deeply consequential. Yet in the end, they tell us not only how Rome held itself together, but how fragile that cohesion truly was. When people remember Rome, they usually remember its loudest forms of power. They remember armies, decrees, public offices, triumphs, conspiracies, assassinations, and emperors who seemed to bend the world around their will. And yet, by the time we reach the end of this story, that version of Rome no longer feels complete. Because Rome was not held together by force alone. It was also held together by quieter bonds, by households, by bloodlines, by inherited obligations, by daughters sent across political lines, by wives who carried legitimacy into new homes, and by children whose existence tied powerful houses together more deeply than speeches ever could. That is one of the great truths these marriages reveal. Power in Rome was never only something displayed in public. Very often it was secured in private. And once we understand that, Rome itself begins to look different. Not smaller, but more intimate, more fragile, more human. If war was Rome's most visible language of power, marriage was one of its quietest structures. It did not move with the drama of battle. It did not announce itself in the same way law did. It did not leave behind monuments as obvious as arches, temples, or statues. And yet, marriage helped organize the people who controlled all of those things. It linked noble houses. It stabilized alliances. It transferred prestige. It carried legitimacy through generations. It allowed politics to survive not only through office, but through kinship. That is why marriage matters so much as a way of understanding Rome. It reveals the hidden architecture beneath the public facade. Behind every great rivalry stood families. Behind every succession crisis stood bloodlines. Behind every carefully staged image of stability stood
Marriage is meant to make that stability feel real. Rome often presented power as public virtue, military glory, or constitutional order. But beneath those surfaces, power often moved through family.
And marriage was one of the main ways that family became political structure. One of the deepest lessons in this story
is that Rome did not divide life the way modern people often do. We tend to separate the personal from the political.
We imagine the home as one sphere and the state as another.
Rome never fully allowed that separation.
In Rome, the household was political. Marriage was political. Inheritance was political. Childbirth was political. Even grief in certain households could become political.
The so-called private world of marriage was never simply private, because the future of status, legitimacy,
alliance, and succession all passed through it. A wedding could redirect loyalties. A widow could alter dynastic balance. A child could become the vessel of continuity, or the source of conflict. That is why Roman marriage feels so weighty. It was domestic, but never merely domestic.
It was intimate, but never untouched by structure.
It was emotional, but never free from consequence. And this may be one of the most Roman things about Rome.
Its most personal institutions often carried the heaviest public burdens.
If this story reveals the hidden architecture of Roman power, it also reveals the people who stood inside that architecture without always being openly acknowledged. Women were among them. Again and again, Roman women appear at the crucial points where power had to be transferred, stabilized, or made legitimate. Through marriage, they connected houses. Through childbirth, they extended dynasties. Through conduct, they embodied the honor of families and regimes. Through proximity, counsel, and memory, they shaped the atmosphere in which power operated.
And yet Rome often described them as if they stood outside formal history.
That contradiction matters because it tells us that Rome
Depended on women more than its own public language was willing to admit.
It needed them to carry continuity, make your way, but often denied them the vocabulary of overt authority. It placed enormous symbolic and dynastic weight upon them, then acted surprised when they became central to political narratives.
This is why figures like Julia and Livia feel so important.
They remind us that Roman women were not simply marginal witnesses to male power. They were often the medium through which that power became durable.
Even in a patriarchal order, the female center of power was real.
It was simply quieter, harder to name, and easier for later history to overlook. Marriage in Rome was powerful because it worked.
It really could bind houses together.
It really could stabilize alliances. It really could support legitimacy. It really could help
powerful families survive across generations. But precisely because it mattered so much, it also exposed Rome's fragility.
The moment a key marriage failed, ended, shifted, or lost its political function, the deeper instability underneath could suddenly become visible. A death could unsettle an alliance.
A remarriage could rearrange succession.
A child could intensify competition instead of resolving it. A household meant to symbolize order could become the place where disorder first revealed itself.
That is why these marriages are historically so revealing.
They show us not only how Rome held itself together, but how much effort it took to do so. What looks from a distance like imperial stability or aristocratic continuity, who often depended on delicate human arrangements. Arrangements vulnerable to death, resentment, ambition, infertility, rivalry, and time. Rome was strong enough to make marriage politically meaningful.
But it was fragile enough to need marriage so badly in the first place.
The reason these stories remain so compelling
is that they pull Rome out of abstraction.
Empires can feel impersonal. Institutions can feel cold. Political systems can feel mechanical. Marriage changes that.
It reminds us that even the largest structures of Roman power were lived through actual people. Fathers negotiating futures, daughters carrying family expectations, wives preserving dignity in dangerous households, sons embodying hopes they did not choose, rulers trying to turn personal ties into political permanence.
Marriage gave Roman power a human face. It turned factions into relatives, It turned alliances into households. It turned succession into something carried through love, pressure, grief, duty, and memory. And because of that, these marriages make Rome feel more complex than a simple story of conquest ever could.
They show us that history is not only made in Senate debates and battle formations, it is also made in arrangements at dinner tables, in the movement of women between houses, unborn in the thought over the birth of an seats amongst the in the intimate spaces where public futures are quietly assembled. That is part of what makes these marriages so haunting. They reveal how deeply human the machinery of power always is. And yet the same fact that makes these marriages so moving also makes them tragic.
Because anything built through human bonds is vulnerable to human weakness. Affection can fail, trust can erode, ambition can overpower loyalty.
Grief can unsettle what strategy once secured.
The people meant to preserve order can become the center of conflict. Rome's marriages reveal this with unusual clarity. The elite tried to transform family into stability. But family itself was never stable enough to bear that burden perfectly. It could help. It could delay collapse. It could make power feel natural. But it could not eliminate mortality, rivalry, or the unpredictable movement of political desire.
This is why Roman marriage belongs not only to the story of order, but also to the story of fracture. It bound Rome together, yeah.
But sometimes it also showed exactly where Rome could come apart.
And perhaps that is the final irony. The institution Rome used to secure continuity was also one of the clearest places where continuity proved most uncertain.
Battles are loud, laws are recorded, emperors leave monuments, victories carve themselves into public memory. Marriage is different. It often works quietly. It leaves fewer heroic images behind. It appears domestic, familiar, almost secondary beside the grand language of empire. That silence is precisely why it is so often overlooked. And yet silence does not mean insignificance. Sometimes it means depth. Marriage mattered in Rome not because it was dramatic in the obvious way, but because it was structural. It was part of the hidden framework that allowed noble houses to cooperate, compete, reproduce themselves, and imagine their futures.
It was one of the means by which private life became the unseen foundation of public power.
That is why it deserves to be remembered. Not as a footnote to Roman politics,
but as one of the ways Roman politics actually functioned.
The marriages that bound Rome's ruling houses together were quiet, but they were never minor.
So what do these marriages finally reveal about Rome? They reveal a civilization that built power not only through conquest, but through kinship.
A ruling class that trusted bloodlines as much as institutions. A political world in which
daughters, wives, mothers, and heirs could quietly shape the course of history. And a system so dependent on personal bonds that even its greatest structures of authority remain deeply human, and therefore deeply fragile.
Rome liked to imagine itself in marble, law, and glory.
But beneath that image stood households.
Beneath its victories stood alliances.
Beneath its public order stood marriages negotiated in private, carrying the weight of ambition, legitimacy, and survival. And perhaps that is the most revealing truth of all. Rome was not only forged in war,
it was also woven in silence. Its noble houses
were not bound together only by power, but by marriage, quiet unions that helped hold a civilization together,
even as they revealed how easily it could come undone.